On a quiet spring afternoon in 1904, in a peaceful village just outside Boston, a woman was found dead inside her own bedroom. At first, it looked like a private tragedy, the kind no one outside the family would ever hear about. But a single discovery, made hours later by a local undertaker, would turn a quiet death into one of the most talked-about murder investigations in Massachusetts history. It would expose the private struggles of a once wealthy family, draw in some of the earliest forensic science ever used in an American courtroom, and end with a man going to the electric chair, still swearing he was innocent. This is the story of Mabel Page, a woman who spent her life caring for others, and whose final hours will be picked apart by detectives, scientists, and an entire nation watching the newspapers. This is the Weston murder. At the turn of the 20th century, Boston stood as one of the great cities of the United States, a place where old New England customs collided with the restless energy of a new industrial age. Its streets carried the rattle of horse-drawn carriages alongside the electric hum of trolley cars. Ships crowded its harbor, factories drew workers by the thousands, and the city's wealth sat uneasily beside its overcrowded immigrant neighborhoods. It was a city of contrasts, old money and new arrivals, comfort and hardship, all packed into the same few miles of waterfront and cobblestone. Just beyond this noise and crowding lay smaller communities, places where Boston's more established families retreated when they wanted distance from city life. Weston was one of these villages, quiet, wooded, and largely undisturbed by the changes reshaping the city nearby. It was the kind of place where a family could own several acres of land, live behind a screen of pine trees, and go days without a single visitor passing near the house. It was into this stillness that tragedy would arrive. Mabel Page was born in Boston on the 14th of December, 1862. She grew up in comfort, the daughter of a family that, for a time, wanted for nothing. At 20, she became engaged to be married, a milestone that, for a woman of her era and standing, was expected to define the rest of her life. But the engagement collapsed before the wedding ever took place. It was widely believed within the family circle that opposition from relatives had played a role in ending the match. Her former fiancé eventually left Boston altogether and never returned to renew the relationship. Mabel never married after that. By 1904, she was 41 years old, living quietly with her father and brother in the family's Weston home, a house her father, Redwood Page, had owned since 1884. The Pages had once known real wealth. Redwood Page had built a fortune dealing in steel and iron, prosperous enough to maintain a residence on Commonwealth Avenue, among the most fashionable addresses in Boston, while keeping the Weston property purely as a country retreat. But fortunes built in one generation are not always secure in the next. A series of poor investments in Southern Railroad ventures steadily ate away at the family's wealth, and by the early 1900s, the Pages' circumstances had changed considerably. Redwood Page was by then retired, and the household increasingly depended on the income of his two children, his son, Harold, and his daughter, Mabel. That burden fell most heavily on Mabel. Her mother had suffered years of poor health before dying in 1902, and in the aftermath, the responsibility of running the household passed naturally to her only daughter. She accepted the role without complaint. She was known as a woman of quiet habits, an avid reader, skilled at sewing and embroidery, who devoted much of her time to her father's comfort and her brother's welfare. Life in Weston moved at a very different pace from life in Boston. The Page house stood set back from the road, shielded by pine trees, without close neighbors to observe who came and went. It was a private, self-contained existence, the kind that offered peace, but also, as events would prove, real vulnerability. If someone in that house cried out for help, there was a genuine chance that no one beyond the property would ever hear it. Thursday, the 31st of March, 1904, began as an unremarkable day. Harold Page left early to catch his train into Boston, where he worked for the Boston and Albany Railroad. Shortly after 10 o'clock, Redwood Page departed for nearby Auburndale on business of his own. Around the same time, the family's maid, Amy Roberts, prepared to leave for the day, planning to visit friends in Cambridge. Before she left, Miss Roberts asked Mabel for a small amount of money. Mabel obliged, handing over 25 cents. And as the maid thanked her and turned to go, she noticed that a paper bill still remained visible in Mabel's purse. It was an ordinary, forgettable moment. No one could have known it would later matter to investigators piecing together Mabel's final hours. By 10 o'clock, the maid had gone. Mabel Page was alone in the house. At approximately 11 o'clock, a laundry delivery man named Henry Maynard arrived with the week's washing. Mabel answered the door herself, accepted the bundle, paid what was owed, and exchanged a few words with him before he continued on his route. It would be the last confirmed sighting of Mabel Page alive. At around 2 o'clock that afternoon, Redwood Page returned home from Auburndale and found he could not get in. The front door was locked. Expecting his daughter to be home, he made his way around to the side entrance instead, and this time the door opened. He stepped inside and called out for Mabel. There was no answer. Walking into the living room, he noticed a note lying on the writing table, and a knot of concern began to form. The note read, "I've just heard Harold is hurt and is in Massachusetts General Hospital. Have gone in at 12 o'clock. We'll leave key of front side door with key of the barn stair, and we'll telephone Mrs. Bennett." The message troubled him immediately. If Mabel had genuinely rushed off to Boston, why had the back door been left unlocked rather than secured, as the note described? He searched the places mentioned for the keys, but found nothing. His unease deepening by the minute, he climbed the stairs toward his daughter's bedroom. As he reached the landing and looked through the doorway, he saw Mabel lying motionless on the floor. She was still dressed as though prepared to leave the house, her hat still sitting on her head. For a few long moments, Redwood Page simply stood there, unable to process what he was looking at. Then he ran outside, stopped a passerby, and begged them to fetch help from Mrs. Bennett, one of the few neighbors in the area who on telephone. From the Bennett house, calls went out to Dr. Harrisby, Frost, and to the local police station. Officer McAuliffe was the first to arrive, and Redwood Page led him upstairs to where his daughter lay. The officer noted that Mabel's body rested between the table and the bed. She was dressed for outdoor travel, walking shoes, a hat, a coat, although her skirt was missing. And on closer inspection, he found a long, jagged wound across her throat. Dr. Frost arrived shortly after and examined the body alongside the officer, then sent for the district medical examiner, Dr. Julian Meade. When Dr. Meade arrived, he focused his attention almost entirely on the throat wound. He did not undress the body or carry out a more thorough physical examination. Based on what he observed, he concluded that Mabel Page had taken her own life. Still, out of caution, he left instructions that the undertaker was not to begin embalming until he returned the following day for a more complete inspection. That evening, local undertaker John Bruce began preparing Mabel's body for burial. As he removed her clothing, he made a discovery that changed everything. The wound to her throat was only part of the story. Hidden beneath her garments were multiple stab wounds to her chest, her abdomen, her back. One had driven deep into her heart. This was not a death by her own hand. This was murder. Bruce immediately stopped his work and alerted the authorities. But the damage from the initial misjudgment had already been done. More than 24 hours had passed since the body was found, time during which the house had not been treated as an active crime scene, because doctors believed they were looking at suicide, not a killing. Investigators had lost a critical window at the very outset of the case. The Massachusetts District Police took over the investigation and began a thorough search of the house. Almost immediately, a curious clue surfaced. Near Mabel's body lay a small slip of paper, torn from the same writing pad she had used for the note to her father. On it was written a name and address: J.L. Morton, Charlestown, Massachusetts. The second note deepened the mystery rather than solving it. Detectives searched for any trace of a man named J.L. Morton at that Charlestown address, but every lead led nowhere. No one by that name could be connected to it, and neither Redwood nor Harold Page had ever heard Mabel speak of anyone called Morton. It was a strange thing to leave beside a murder victim, and no one could explain what purpose it served. Investigators worked to reconstruct Mabel's final hour. Medical evidence indicated she had eaten only a light lunch shortly before her death. The wording of her note, precise about the time, have gone in at 12 o'clock, convinced detectives she had written it just before going upstairs to change, believing she was about to make an urgent trip into Boston. From where she stood writing in the living room, she would have had a clear view of the wall clock only a few feet away, so investigators were confident she knew exactly what time it was as she wrote those words. Cross-referenced with Henry Maynard's account of his laundry delivery, the evidence narrowed the likely time of the murder to somewhere around midday. One by one, the household was cleared. Witnesses confirmed Redwood Page's movements in Auburndale right up until his return just after 2 o'clock. Harold Page's colleagues confirmed he had remained at work in Boston the entire day. Amy Roberts could account for her time in Cambridge. None of them could possibly have returned to the house to commit the crime. The police reached a difficult conclusion. Mabel Page had been killed by someone from outside her own family, an intruder. After questioning a number of young men in the area, investigators' attention settled on Charles Lewis Tucker, an unemployed young widower. When questioned, Tucker claimed he had spent the day near Weston Bridge, roughly half a mile from the Page house, and said he had seen road workers and carpenters nearby. He denied ever going to the Page residence. He acknowledged once owning a hunting knife, but insisted he no longer had it. With nothing to directly contradict his story, police released him. The next morning, newspapers ran Tucker's photograph, naming him as a possible suspect, and that publication produced an unexpected break in the case. In nearby Quincy, a fish dealer named Arthur J. Woodward recognized the young man's picture and came forward. He told detectives that Tucker had ridden with him on his fish cart on the day of the murder. More importantly, after Tucker climbed down, Woodward found an empty leather knife sheath left behind on the seat exactly where his passenger had been sitting. When detectives examined the sheath closely, they noticed something unusual. One end bore clear bite marks, as though someone had gripped it tightly in their teeth, leaving behind the distinct impression of individual teeth. Meanwhile, officers went back over Tucker's earlier claims about seeing workmen near the Page property. They discovered that the laborers and carpenters he described had actually finished their work and left the area by noon, meaning his account of seeing them in the afternoon could not be true. Tucker was brought back in for further questioning, and officers searched his home. Inside the lining of one of his coats, they found fragments of a broken hunting knife. It appeared someone had deliberately snapped the blade apart and attempted to file away the manufacturer's markings. The search also turned up a decorative stick pin bearing a Canadian emblem. Questioned again about these discoveries, Tucker offered no real explanation, giving only vague, evasive answers. What followed was, for its time, an unusually scientific investigation. Forensic analysis, still a novelty in early 20th century American courtrooms, became central to building the case. Experts compared the broken knife fragments recovered from Tucker's coat with the wounds on Mabel Page's body, concluding that they came from a single-edged hunting knife entirely consistent with the injuries inflicted. When the fragments were reassembled, they formed a blade capable of producing exactly the kind of wounds found on the victim. Attention also returned to the leather sheath recovered by Arthur Woodward. Dental specialists compared the bite marks pressed into the leather against a cast taken from Tucker's own teeth and concluded that the impressions matched his dental pattern closely, an early and striking use of forensic dentistry in a criminal case. Further forensic work reinforced the prosecution's theory. Microscopic analysis of fibers recovered from Mabel's clothing revealed traces matching carpet from other rooms in the house, not just her bedroom. This told investigators something important. The attack had not occurred where the body was found. Mabel had been assaulted elsewhere in the house before being moved into the bedroom, where her killer had attempted to stage the scene to look like a suicide. Even the mysterious J.L. Morton note took on new significance. Handwriting specialists compared it against samples of Tucker's own writing and concluded that he was very likely its author. Piece by piece, the evidence had assembled itself into a single, damning picture. On the strength of this mounting evidence, Charles Lewis Tucker was formally charged with the murder of Mabel Page. The case exploded into public attention. Newspapers seized on the revelation that Tucker's own wife had drowned some years earlier, leaving him a widower. Some coverage treated it as simple family tragedy, while other reporting speculated darkly about whether there was more to her death, despite there being no evidence whatsoever linking Tucker to it or suggesting it was anything but an accident. The public appetite for the story was enormous. The murder of a quiet, respectable, middle-aged woman inside the supposed safety of her own home had unsettled readers across New England, and the unusual blend of circumstantial evidence and cutting-edge forensic science made sure that every fresh development received prominent newspaper coverage. When the trial opened at East Cambridge, the courtroom was packed day after day. Attorney General Herbert Parker led the prosecution, while James Vahey headed Tucker's defense. Both sides had spent months preparing expert testimony spanning medicine, handwriting analysis, dentistry, and forensic science, making the trial one of the most scientifically complex murder proceedings Massachusetts had ever seen. The prosecution's theory was methodical. They argued that Tucker had engineered a false story about a hospital emergency to gain entry into the Page residence. That Mabel, believing her brother had been injured, had written her note to her father before Tucker attacked and killed her with a hunting knife, stole the money she was carrying, and then attempted to disguise the crime by leaving the fabricated J.L. Morton note beside her body. Prosecutors emphasized that Tucker had prior familiarity with the layout of the house, having previously known Mabel's brother, Harold. Jurors were shown the reassembled knife blade, the leather sheath, photographs documenting the wounds, the handwriting comparisons, and the Canadian stick pin recovered during the search of Tucker's belongings. The defense fought back against each piece of evidence in turn. Tucker himself denied ever having entered the Page house and insisted the knife fragments, the sheath, and the handwriting analysis had all been misread or misinterpreted by the prosecution's experts. Witnesses were called to challenge the ownership of the stick pin, and defense experts pushed back against several of the prosecution's scientific conclusions. Despite this, the prosecution held its position that every piece of circumstantial evidence pointed in the same direction. Tucker had been near the scene. His account of his own movements that day had been directly contradicted. The knife fragments matched the murder weapon. The bite marks on the sheath matched his teeth. And the strange, misleading note bearing the name J.L. Morton appeared, by every expert's assessment, to have been written in his own hand. After weeks of testimony, the jury retired to deliberate. 8 hours later, they returned with their decision. Charles Lewis Tucker was found guilty of first-degree murder. The conviction did not immediately close the case. Tucker's lawyers appealed, arguing that the evidence, largely circumstantial, built heavily on emerging and unproven forensic techniques, was not sufficient to sustain a murder conviction. The appeals failed. A final plea for clemency was brought before the governor of Massachusetts. Despite widespread public sympathy and thousands of signatures gathered urging that his death sentence be commuted, the governor declined to intervene. On the morning of the 12th of June, 1906, Charles Lewis Tucker was executed in the electric chair at Charlestown State Prison. To the very end, he maintained his innocence, insisting he had played no part in the murder of Mabel Page. The Tucker case left a lasting mark on American criminal investigation. It stood among the earliest instances in which forensic dentistry, microscopic fiber analysis, and handwriting comparison were used together to build a criminal case, at a time when such methods were viewed with as much skepticism as promise. The case demonstrated both the power and the risk of this new scientific approach, a conviction built almost entirely on physical evidence and expert interpretation, rather than direct testimony or confession. It also exposed a critical failure in the earliest hours of the investigation. Because the initial examining doctor concluded, without a full examination, that Mabel Page had died by her own hand, valuable time was lost before the crime scene was properly secured and treated as a homicide. That error would go on to influence how future investigators approached unexplained deaths, underscoring the importance of thorough examination before drawing conclusions, no matter how obvious a scene might first appear. More than a century later, the murder of Mabel Page remains a case study in the birth of modern forensic investigation in the United States. It is remembered not only for the brutality of the crime itself, but for the methods used to solve it, methods that at the time were genuinely new to American courtrooms, and that would go on to shape how physical evidence was gathered and presented in criminal trials for decades to come. Mabel Page spent her adult life quietly caring for others, her ailing mother, her aging father, her working brother, asking for little in return. She never sought public attention, and in the end, her death brought her more of it than her life ever had. Her murder became a landmark case, not because of who she was, but because of what her death revealed. How easily a killer could almost erase the truth of a crime, and how a new generation of scientific investigation was just beginning to make sure that truth could still be found. Charles Lewis Tucker went to his death, still denying any part in what happened inside that quiet house in Weston. Whether the jury's verdict truly settled the matter, or whether questions still linger over evidence built on techniques still in their infancy, is something history has left for each of us to weigh for ourselves. Thank you for watching this Freedom Dark Records documentary. If you enjoyed this case, let us know in the comments, and we'll see you in the next investigation.